Hey everyone, I am Becky Julian, and this week I'm leading our discussion on Mitchell Chapter 11 and the Swain article. The Mitchell chapter looks at where the field of SLA is now, especially how different theoretical perspectives relate to each other. And the Swain article builds on that by focusing on the role of emotion in language learning and how it connects to cognition and social interaction. I'm going to frame this presentation around how these ideas fit together, especially thinking about where emotion fits in within the broader system of SLA. So throughout this course, we have been introduced to multiple theories of second language acquisition. One of the things that's become clear is that these theories aren't really competing with each other. They're helping us understand different parts of a much bigger, complex process. So if learning is already complex, the Swain article pushes us to think about what happens when we bring emotion into that picture. Not just as something that influences learning, but how it actually relates to cognition and social interaction. So the question I want to frame this discussion around is, if SLA is already a complex system of interconnected theories, what happens when we consider emotion as part of that system, and how does it relate to cognition and social interaction? To guide this discussion, I'm going to focus on four things. We're going to briefly revisit those SLA perspectives as interconnected. We're examining how emotion is positioned within learning in the Swain article. We're exploring how emotion connects to cognition and social interaction. And finally, we're considering what this added complexity means for how we understand second language learning. So up to this point, we've looked at several different theories of SLA: cognitive, sociocultural, and more recently, dynamic and complexity perspectives. Very briefly, I'm going to define those. Cognitive approaches focus on how learners process and store language internally. Sociocultural theory emphasizes learning through social interaction and mediation. And dynamic or complexity perspectives view learning as nonlinear and constantly changing over time. So rather than asking which theory is correct, the field is moving towards understanding language learning as a complex interconnected system shaped by multiple interacting factors. And this is the system that Swain's article begins to complicate further. So if we think about SLA as already being this complex, interconnected system, the Swain article pushes that further by asking us to reconsider where emotion fits. Traditionally, emotion's been treated as something separate, almost like a variable that can influence learning, like motivation or anxiety. But Swain challenges that idea. She argues that emotion isn't just affecting learning from the outside. It's instead, emotion and cognition are actually inseparable. So it's not just that we think first and then feel something about it. Those processes are happening at the same time, and they're shaping each other. She also emphasizes that emotion isn't just internal or individual, it's social. It develops and is expressed through interaction with others. So this shifts how we think about learning, from something that is mainly cognitive to something that's both cognitive and emotional, happening within that social interaction. To make this idea more concrete, Swain uses an example of two students, Sophie and Rachel, working together on a language task. They're trying to reconstruct a phrase in French, and as they do that, they realize they don't fully know how to form it correctly. So what we see is them working through this problem together. They're testing ideas, questioning forms, and trying to figure out what sounds right. Swain actually analyzes this interaction through four different lenses. From a cognitive perspective, we see them noticing gaps and testing their understanding. From a sociocultural perspective, they're building knowledge together through interaction. And then the private speech lens shows how some of what they're saying is helping them organize their own thinking. Then she adds the emotional lens. There's a clear emotional layer to what's happening. There's encouragement between them. We see some frustration when they get stuck, and then there's a sense of satisfaction when they figure it out. And what Swain is pointing out is that these emotions aren't separate from the thinking process. They're happening at the same time and are part of how learning is unfolding. So rather than learning happening before or after this interaction, the learning is happening in the interaction itself through both the cognitive work and the emotional experience. From a sociocultural perspective, and this is something I've been especially interested in as I've been working on my own research, what's important here is the emotion isn't just something happening inside the learner. It's actually social. When we go back to that example of Rachel and Sophie, it's not just that each student is feeling something individually, but their emotions are actually shaped through their interaction, through how they respond to each other, support each other, and work through that task together. This connects really closely to sociocultural theory, where learning is understood as something that happens through dialogue, collaboration, and shared activity. So emotion isn't separate from the social side of learning. It's part of the process. So this brings me to the question, how does emotion relate to cognition? Traditionally, emotion has been treated as something that influences cognition. For example, we might say that anxiety affects learning or that motivation helps learning. But Swain is pushing us to think about this differently. Instead of seeing emotion and cognition as two separate systems interacting, she argues they are actually inseparable. So when learners are working through a problem, like in the example with Rachel and Sophie that we looked at, they're not just thinking and then feeling something about it. Those processes are happening at the same time and they're shaping each other in real time. She uses a Vygotsky's analogy of water to explain this, which I really liked. You can't understand water by separating the hydrogen and the oxygen because those properties come from how they work together. And the same idea applies here. We can't fully understand language learning if we try to separate thinking from feeling. Now, what does this mean for SLA? If SLA is already a complex system, what happens when we bring emotion into it? What these readings suggest is that we're not really adding something new. We're recognizing something that was already there and accounting for it. Language learning isn't just cognitive, it's not just social, it's also emotional, and these elements aren't separate from each other. They're all working together as part of the same process. So rather than simplifying or changing our understanding of learning, bringing in emotion actually highlights just how complex and interconnected the process really is. And I think that's what both readings are really pushing us towards, seeing language learning as a fully interconnected system rather than something we can break into separate parts. Well, I hope that that presentation has helped you understand the chapter and the Swain article a little bit better. I wanted to end this by opening this up for a little bit of further thought and some future discussion with a couple of questions. First, does thinking about emotion as inseparable from cognition change how you interpret what's actually happening during language learning? And second, where do you see emotion and social interaction shaping learning in your own context? Thank you for listening. I've also added a QR code here for a quick little activity since this was the last chapter of our textbook, where you can just enter a couple of words and we'll create a word cloud of people's description of second language acquisition theory. There'll be a link for it as well on the discussion board, and I look forward to continuing this conversation this week.